Minasan, konnichiwa. I'm Veronica Lewis, and today on Let's Go Dutch, we're in Japan.
I'm gonna travel the world. I'm gonna go where the Dutch have been, and I'm gonna share it with you, my friends. Let's go Dutch. Let's go Dutch. Let's go Dutch.
We'll venture to Hirado, site of the original Dutch trading post. We'll then follow in the VOC footsteps to Dejima. So put on your clogs and let's go Dutch. 1602. Japan was ruled by the shogun. Halfway around the world, the Dutch East India Company was formed. Their mission? Ply the Asian trade routes and build and maintain trading posts. In 1609, the same year Henry Hudson sailed into New York Harbor, the Dutch East India Company arrived in Japan with a diplomatic mission, seeking an audience with the shogun. Before we go on, I want to mention that we'll be referring to the Dutch East India Company as the VOC, so we need to talk about what that means. Willem, you pronounce it better than me, so step up from the camera. Kudasai.
Hello, Ida-Rain.
Nay, we're in Japan.
Konnichiwa. VOC. It stands for Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. Verenigde means united, so they are the United East India Company.
So as you can see, it's a lot easier to just say VOC. The emperor was essentially a figurehead. It was the shogun who held the power and who the Europeans came to pay respect and seek trade agreements with. Kyoto, which is where the Emperor of Japan resided, was the former capital. In the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate moved to Edo, later to be known as Tokyo. 2 centuries before the Dutch, Vasco da Gama spread the seas of Portugal around Asia. Like the English, the Portuguese explorers and traders worked on behalf of a single monarch. The Dutch provinces, although united, did not have a single monarch. This might not seem like a big deal, but in Middle-Age diplomatic missions, this was a major problem. The shogun wouldn't just deal with any old slub. The European powers presented themselves on behalf of nobility, while the Dutch were essentially a company of merchants. So here's what the Dutch did. They propped up Prince Maurits as a monarch. The VOC sent a diplomatic mission with letters from the non-existent King of Holland. Tokyo. Bustling, jam-packed. And it's been this way pretty much since 1721. The original name was Edo, which means estuary. Before the shogun moved his bakufu here, Edo was merely a fishing village. 1609 wasn't the first Dutch mission to sail into Edo. Nay, just 4 years before the VOC was established, a company from Rotterdam sent 5 ships to Japan. It took them 2 years to reach Japan, and by that time, 4 of the ships had perished. Not only that, but 3/4 of the crew perished as well, leaving only 24 frail, raggy seamen. This is how they presented themselves to the shogun. Needless to say, he wasn't impressed. Sailing for the VOC in 1606 and armed with letters from Prince Maurits, the mission arrived in 1609, and this time they were well received. The royal facade worked. We'll pick up the Dutch trail at our first stop, Hirado. From Tokyo, it's a 2-hour flight to Nagasaki, and then an hour-plus bus ride to Hirado. Thanks to the magic of editing, we're here in a snap.
For the VOC, it wasn't a snap at all. 2 or 3 years to get to Japan from Holland is what that journey took. It was so long that in 1608 a letter had to be dispatched to the shogun from a trading factory in Patani to assure him more Dutch were indeed coming.
Hirado was a hub of foreign contact with Japan's neighbors, Korea and China. It was here that the European trading posts were established. The Spanish and Portuguese were already established in Japan by the time the Dutch arrived. The Dutch managed to nudge them out of the way, and in 1609, the shogun issued the VOC a handelspass, a trading pass. It was here on Hirado where the first Dutch trading post, or factory, was established. This reconstruction of the original building is now a museum. If you think Tokyo is jam-packed, this museum is jam-packed with history. The VOC trading post lasted from 1609 to 1641. This warehouse was built in 1639, and at the time, it was the largest Western-style building of its kind in Japan. The shogun ordered it demolished in 1641.
Japan was heading into a period of isolationism, and there were strict rules to adhere to. In typical Dutch fashion, they put a 1639 anno stain up on the gable. This angered the shogun because it was a Christian date marking and was forbidden. The post was demolished and the Dutch were moved elsewhere. For right now, though, we're going to keep our elsewhere right here and explore this museum. The front sports a trio of spout gables. You can see the Dutch used the typical wall anchors so common on the old buildings of this age. The shuttered windows, and especially the ones with the rounded top, are also common on the warehouses found on Amsterdam's canals. While the middle gable has the big double staircase, the 2 end buildings have a hood over the top window. They probably had a hook and pulley system to hoist goods to the top floor, another feature of the Amsterdam houses.
Before construction of this post, the VOC rented a single building here in Hirado. As trade increased through the years, they expanded their property, culminating in the 1639 trading post. Faithfully recreating the Dutch trading factory starts with the thick beams that were used. we have a model of the ship Dejima, the first ship that arrived in Japan. This suit of armor was made in the Netherlands and presented to the Matsuura clan. Sharing the display case are two globes made in Amsterdam in 1700 by Gerard Valk and his son. There's a portrait of Jacques Spex, who served as the first director of the post. The interactive globe pinpoints the VOC trading posts around Asia with pop-up info bubbles. The top floor has an assortment of games that the Dutch passed the time with. Along the wall, outside the warehouse, is the wharf, used by the Dutch ships to dock and unload. VOC records from 1641 mention a watergate, which these stairs led to. The Dutch were masters of controlling water and also stealing land back from the sea. The light beacon at the end of the wall was used for protection during the land reclamation phase of building. Heading a little further inland, we come across the Dutch well and the Dutch wall. Well,
Wall.
this is the Dutch well. It's called a river on a map from 1792. Maybe, just maybe, there was an underground freshwater river, and the Dutch cut an access to it. Right around the corner is the Dutch Wall, which was about 100 feet long and just over 6 feet high.
It was a multi-purpose wall. It hid the post from view, kept burglars away, and in case of fire, kept it from spreading. A pretty good wall indeed. And not only that, but the cement they used had not been previously seen or used in Japan.
Bridging the harbor and the Matsuura Museum is the Reikishi no Michi, the Road of History. It was set up to commemorate 400 years of history between the Dutch and Japan. This guy is William Adams. He was an Englishman hired by the Dutch in 1598 as a ship navigator. It was his ship, the Liefde, which was the only ship of 5 to make it to Japan in 1600. Although that trip didn't go well, Adams did manage to become a diplomatic advisor to the Tokugawa shogun. He was completely instrumental in paving the way for the VOC and the establishment of the Hirado trading factory. Next, we have Jacques Spex, born in Dordrecht in 1585. With the help of William Adams, Specs was granted permission to build the trading post and became its first director. Here we have Lord Takanobu Matsura. He was among the few who saw the potential that foreign trade could bring to Japan and is indeed known as the father of foreign trade.
Hey, speaking of trade, one of the things the Dutch brought to Japan was paint. Those Dutch masters. When they built the post, they painted the exterior walls, something unknown in Japan at the time.
The Matsura clan ruled Hirado during the time the Dutch arrived, and their museum retains artifacts from this period. Our next stop, the Matsura Museum, located just a stone's throw from the trading post. At the time the Dutch were here, Japan was a land with samurai. The Matsura Museum displays many artifacts from this time period. This elaborate suit of armor is from the 16th century. It was given to the 26th Lord of Hirado from the Lord of Bungo. Bungo Prefecture is actually where the ship Delifta arrived in Japan. Screens are very common in this part of the world, and this museum has some finely painted ones. Some have battle scenes playing out, but done quite delicately. What's interesting about this one is the artist was from the Tokugawa shogunate during the Dutch period. When the daughter of the Lord of Hyogo married the Lord of Hirado in 1831, she made the journey in this norimono on the shoulders of her servants. The Matsura clan left behind a fine collection of scrolls and books. In Japan, bridges were made of wood. This one, known as the Dutch Bridge, was made of stone and built with techniques brought by the Dutch. It connects the Matsura or Hirado Castle with the town. High up on a cliff overlooking the harbor is Hirado Castle. The original castle was built by the 26th Lord of the Matsura clan. It took 12 years to build, finishing in 1611. But then, just 2 years later, it was deliberately burned down as a sign of loyalty to the Tokugawa shogunate. In 1704, construction began on a new castle. High walls and watchtowers protect the main tower. The main tower has projections and interactive displays to teach the history and building of the castle. This impressive samurai suit of armor belonged to the 35th Lord of the Matsura clan. The top of the main tower offers panoramic views of Hirado Harbor, the Dutch trading post, and the islands and sea beyond. In the Kinjo Watchtower, the theme is the VOC era in Hirado. These were the directors of the VOC. This painting is the Dutch city of Hoorn, which had a chamber of the VOC. Below the castle is the Kameoka Shrine, dating back to 1880. In 1641, when Ieyasu Tokugawa had the Dutch factory demolished, he also kicked them out of Hirado. He had the VOC moved to an artificial island called Dejima, located in Nagasaki Bay. Dejima, now fully a part of the mainland, is where we pick up the next part of the VOC trail. The Dejima Dutch trading post is long gone, but guess what? They recreated some of it. Mina-sama, I present to you the Dejima Dutch trading post. By the time the Dutch were relocated to Dejima, Japan was already well into its long period of isolation. Foreigners were no longer welcome, but the Dutch had the only permission in town to conduct trade between Japan and the outside world, with one caveat: they were confined to their fan-shaped artificial island.
The original post took 2 years to build, finishing in 1636. It was the Portuguese who were first confined to Dejima, but they were kicked out, and in 1641, the Dutch were relocated here. So, what say we explore this mini town where the Dutch held court for over 200 years?
We start at what is called the chief factor residence. The Dutch trading posts were known as a factory, and this was the boss's house. By the way, the word boss comes from the Dutch Bos. It was a nickname the seamen called the captain. On the first floor, there are several galleries to wander through. Anyone for a game of billiards? This room has interactive exhibits to learn about the post. You'll be tested on this later, or, well, that's what the cannon's for. Let's view the rooms upstairs. This first room was used for meetings with Dutch and Japanese officials.
This room was used for administrative purposes.
This was the main dining room and also used for hosting special events. Smakelijk eten. This was the master bedroom. The boss had a nice size room.
Como bena? This room was a parlor where you just might be able to have a drink at the end of a busy day. Prost!
The bell outside the chief factor's residence was used to mark the time. In the 18th century, it was ringing in the time in the Netherlands. This was a sea gate where the cargo was carried by small boats to and from anchored ships. This building is known as the first ship captain's quarters. On the second floor is where the captain of visiting ships stayed.
While the captain lived upstairs, the ground floor had a weight beam and was also used to store sugar.
Upstairs, we find the living quarters. I don't know about you, but it looks like the boss had a better bedroom than the boss. Next to the first ship captain's quarters are 3 warehouses. This first warehouse was used to store sugar. This is warehouse number 2. Here they stored sapin wood, which was used to make dye. This is warehouse number 3. It was another storage for sugar and other goods. Next to the warehouses was the head clerk's quarters. He kept records of all goods coming and going, as well as other documents. Many people passed through Dejima, usually only serving for just 1 year. Notable names include Carl Thunberg, who wrote books on the flora and fauna of Japan. Philip von Siebold worked here as a physician and established a school of Western medicine, as well as writing about Japan. The longest-serving chief factor was Hendrik Doof from Amsterdam. This Dutch-Japanese dictionary is his work. There are various ship models on display. Here, too, in Dejima, they have a model of De Liefde, the first ship to reach Japan. This model is a Portuguese ship. They were here before the Dutch, but were kicked out. They brought Christianity to Japan, which led to the Shimabara Rebellion in 1637. The Dutch, on the other hand, were merchant traders and left religion out of their business. One of the spices coveted by the VOC was cloves. Needless to say, this warehouse smelled pretty good. We had the head clerk's quarters, and here we have the quarters of the other record keepers. Who doesn't like sugar? No one. That's why even more sugar was stored in this warehouse. This was the town elder's room. They kept an eye on the front gate. This was the foreman's room. Japanese copper was weighed and packed here.
Copper was a major import from Japan, and this warehouse behind the foreman's room is where it was stored.
Japan, a land of contradictions, ancient yet modern, steep in culture and tradition, but on the cutting edge of technology. When the Dutch came here in 1598, they found a strange land with unknown customs and, of course, a foreign language. They were regarded as barbarians, yet they encountered samurai who would lop off a head in an instant, with swords sharper and thinner than what was known in Europe. The Japanese grew to admire the Dutch, who, unlike the Portuguese, had no interest in bringing religion into their business dealings. They were the only Westerners allowed in during Japan's long period of sakoku, or isolation. I hope you've enjoyed this orange view of Japan. I'm Veronica Lewis. Join us again next time on Let's Go Dutch as we explore more of Holland and beyond. Tot ziens!